الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول
صلى
الله،
الله
وعلى
عليه
آلك وأصحابك
وسلم
يا
يا
سيدي
سيدي
يا
يا
حبيب
حبيب
الله.
الله.
Yunus alayhi salam was from a different area, Iraq, as I told you. But Ilyas alayhi salam and his successor, Ilyasa alayhi salam, was the leader of the Israelites who continued onwards. And even after the great feats of Ilyasa alayhi salam and the people rallying around him, the latter generations of the Israelites, the believers, they eventually drifted away from the religion of Hanif again, once more, the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to idol worship. And this is mentioned in the Quran many times regarding the Jews who again and again would divert from the path of Islam. They would be favored upon, they would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for things, Allah would favor them with it. But then they would do nashukri and remember or associate it to something else again. So time kept going onwards, and because of their transgressions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroyed their kingdom once more. After a couple of hundreds of years, Uzair alayhi salam came. Just before the coming of Uzair alayhi salam, the people had become so weak and so spiritually weak and away from the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah sent them a punishment in the form of another king. That king came and destroyed all of the temple of Sulaiman alayhi salam and all of Jerusalem as well, until it was left empty basically. There were weeds growing and destruction everywhere, nothing left behind. Even Uzair alayhi salam himself was taken as a prisoner to Babylon. All of the Israelites were taken as prisoners to Babylon, and they spent a time there. Approximately some time later, Uzair alayhi salam, who was a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he was traveling back on a donkey when he passed by the place of Jerusalem, and he wondered to himself that how will Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring this place back from what it is now? How will this regrow when it's been destroyed so much? So when he thought this to himself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said to him, he wanted to teach him. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave death to Uzair alayhi salam. For 100 years, Uzair alayhi salam was not alive anymore, until he was brought back 100 years later by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the meantime, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had corrupted the state of Jerusalem, that another Assyrian king came and he defeated the Babylonians, and he allowed the Israelites to settle in the area once more. He allowed them to rebuild as well. But their only weakness now was, once they had started rebuilding, that they didn't know the Torah anymore. They had lost the Torah. Now they had understood once more that every time we deviate from the path of true religion, of the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a destruction comes upon us. They had split into two groups. One was the lost 10 tribes, which eventually faded out through history. And one were the northern Judah, or Judea. These were the followers of Uzair alayhi salam. But they didn't have the Torah. So eventually, in that time when they had reclaimed it, 100 years had passed, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought Uzair alayhi salam back from the dead again, subhanAllah, to teach him. You know, the thought that he wondered, how will Allah bring this? Allah brought him back, and there were the things that were surrounded him. He had grapes and some fruit with him. And then the donkey that he was riding, the grapes and fruit were untouched, as was Uzair alayhi salam, because Allah had brought him back to life again. But to teach him in even greater detail, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, "Oh Uzair," he sent an angel to ask him that, "Uzair, what do you think? How long has it been?" Uzair alayhi salam replied, it might have been a couple of hours maybe, because the sun hasn't set yet. Yawman aw ba'da yawm. Someone asked him, how long has it been? And he replied, it might have been a day maybe, or some hours, subhanAllah. And Allah then told him to look down at your things. Look at the fruit, look at the grapes. And he replied, then he looked at the grapes and he saw, then he was told to look at the donkey. The donkey's bones were showing, subhanAllah. The bleached bones. You know when 100 years passed by and there's no skin left? The donkey was in that state. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructed the donkey to stand, subhanAllah. And he saw while he was looking at it, meat came on it, limbs stood once more, and the donkey was brought back to life. So he rode it, and he went back to the place of Jerusalem, subhanAllah. Until when he arrived, it had been 100 years. He went to an old lady, he went to the area where he used to live, and he found an old lady who was now 120 years old, near her death. She couldn't stand properly, and he said to her that I am Uzair. He said, Uzair disappeared 100 years ago, where are you coming from? So he, with his prowess that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him, he wiped over her eyes and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala returned her eyesight to her. She stood up. She saw that it was actually Uzair Alaihissalaam. She went into the marketplace, into the open, and informed everyone. And they all said, if you are truly Uzair, if you are truly the Prophet of Allah, Alaihissalaam, then recite to us the Torah. Tell us and give us the Torah. So he sat down next to a tree and he recalled all of the Torah by his memory, subhanAllah, by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah entered a nur into him and he recited it. So he lived among them for a while and he taught them, eventually passing away while teaching them. But unfortunately, from amongst them came a group who started calling him Uzair ibn Allah. They started calling him the son of God, ma'azallah. Just the way the Isai would later call Isa Alaihissalaam the son of Allah. Astaghfirullah. So they started worshipping him as God, which was later told about in the Quran. And those very Yahud and Nasara faced destruction once more. And they did die out once more. They were made slaves and made to be driven out from there again after the coming of Isa alayhi salam. But that we will come to later. The Mufassirin and the Quran directly states that this is shirk with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When they had seen that Uzair alayhi salam has passed away physically in front of us, then how could they claim that he was God or he was the son of God, ma'azallah? Astaghfirullah. What preposterousness. But in any case, many times they would stray from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's path and his worship, and they would associate with the people sent to them. They would sometimes associate divinity with trees, sometimes with idols, sometimes with Baal, ma'azallah, and sometimes they would make prophets into gods. Instead of remembering the one who favored upon them again and again, they would find reasons and excuses to go out of the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then, because they had been tested so many times and been favored so many times, but they still made fasad on the earth, eventually from amongst the children of Uzair alayhi salam came Hazrat Zakaria alayhi salam.